This lesson discusses configuring PHP and MySQL. The topics include: why would you want to configure PHP? How do you configure PHP? What are the most important parameters to configure? Why would you want to configure MySQL? How do you configure MySQL? And what are the most important MySQL parameters to configure? First of all, PHP. There are certain settings which you might want to adjust for security purposes. You can also adjust certain performance settings depending on the nature of the PHP applications that you plan to develop. You can access the PHP configuration, which is located in a file called php.ini, through the XAMPP control panel. In the XAMPP control panel, next to Apache, there's an option called Config. Underneath that, you'll notice there's an option to access the php.ini file. The php.ini file is located under your XAMPP installation folder. Underneath that, there's a folder called PHP. Underneath that, there's a file called php.ini. If you look through this file, you'll notice that it's very well documented, and it gives you some idea of some of the various configuration parameters that you might want to adjust. So, for example, display errors. The default value is off, but for development, it's very important to set this value to on. Error reporting should likewise be set to a very high level for development. It's also very important to make sure that errors are logged. This allows you to access the information in the PHP error log, which is located under the XAMPP PHP folders under logs. Output buffering is a parameter which can be set to a value such as 4096, which will give you improved performance in terms of outputting from your PHP application back to the browser of the user making the request to your website. Looking down the list now, we'll examine some of the more important parameters. We mentioned output buffering, which is recommended to be set to 4096. This will improve performance of your application. The safe mode parameters are recommended to stay off at the current time. The reason for this is that the current version of PHP, which is 5.4, does not have a facility for safe mode, and in future versions of PHP, this mode will be removed from the language. Another parameter, which might be of interest to adjust, is maximum execution time. This is set to 30 seconds. You might need to increase this parameter if you have a script which you've developed which takes a long time to execute. On the other hand, it's also possible that there's an error condition within your script which causes a condition known as an infinite loop. An infinite loop, as the name implies, will continue to loop forever until the program is pulled from the processor by the PHP engine. Accordingly, as it stands now, the PHP engine will only allow your application to execute for a maximum of 30 seconds. Another parameter which is of interest is the memory limit. The default value is 128 megabytes. This represents the maximum amount of memory that your PHP program is allowed to use. If you increase this value, you can create PHP applications that use large amounts of data. On the other hand, once you move your code from your local development server to the production server, it's very possible that the maximum limit may be a lower value. You need to consult the documentation on your web hosting provider in order to verify this information. If you find that they have a lower amount of memory available, you might want to reduce this parameter on your own local computer in order to properly simulate conditions on your web hosting site. The error reporting is generally set to E-all, logical or E-strict. This gives you the maximum amount of error reporting possible. You can then turn the error reporting on by setting display errors equals on your local development server, but you would set this off in the production server, which is located on your web hosting site. You can also override this parameter by using a PHP command called ini_set. You would specify ini_set, display errors in quotes, comma, and then either on or off. Likewise, startup errors is recommended to be on for your local development server and off in production. Error logging is recommended to stay on. This allows you to view the error log at a later time. You'll also notice that the error log setting itself allows you to specify the location of the error log. In the XAMPP installation, it's in your path to your XAMPP folder, PHP logs, the name of the log defaults to PHP_error_log. Another important setting is the include path. The include path tells PHP where to locate library files that you may have downloaded to your web server. External libraries are covered in detail in another lesson. We also have specific settings which are specific to what are called PHP extensions or PHP modules. An example here is the datetime class. The settings would include things such as the default date time zone, which is currently set to a locale which is specific to the local installation. You can also have some other default values such as latitude and longitude. You'll also notice that we have some PHP MySQL settings. For the most part, these settings will be quite sufficient for your needs. You may need to make some adjustments, however, if you receive messages or observe that the performance between PHP and MySQL is insufficient. So, for example, you might want to increase the MySQL cache size to a larger value. It's currently set to 2,000 bytes. You'll notice, however, that the MySQL settings apply to specific MySQL drivers. The MySQL driver itself is now considered obsolete. The recommended driver would be either MySQLi or the PDO MySQL driver. You'll notice we are now looking at the settings for the MySQLi extension. As we move down the list, you might notice that some settings are enabled and others are disabled. For example, because we are not using an Oracle database system, the settings for the Oracle extension are disabled. The way they're disabled is by placing a semicolon in front of the command. If we remove the semicolon, this enables this particular command. MySQL can be configured in a similar manner. If we move over to the XAMPP control panel, next to MySQL, we have a config option. The primary configuration file for MySQL is my.ini. The parameters in the MySQL configuration file should be left as they are for the most part. If you determine that there is a performance issue on your server, the best recommendation is to access the PHP MyAdmin website, which is installed by default by XAMPP. You would go to localhost PHP MyAdmin. Once you are in the PHP MyAdmin screen, you would then go to Status and observe if any of the statistics indicate that there's a need for change. PHP MyAdmin will indicate such statistics by making them red. You can also view query statistics, all status variables. You can pull up a monitor screen, which is a real-time monitor of the performance of your MySQL installation. And finally, under Advisor, you can get advice as to which settings might need to be adjusted. So, for example, on this particular system, long query time might be set to a lower value. You'll also notice log slow queries should be set to on. This allows the PHP MyAdmin and MySQL to monitor the performance of various queries as they're executed from your various programs. Query cache size might be set to a larger value, and query cache type should be set to on. This will allow the queries to be temporarily cached as they're being executed. This will greatly facilitate performance. You'll also notice there are some indications of a structural nature. In this particular example, we notice that because of the lack of indexes in the design of the databases on this system, the queries are performing at less than par. Moving down the list, you can see other suggestions. Again, the default settings in most cases will be sufficient for your purposes. You will also note that when you move your code from your own local development server to a web-hosted environment, you will most likely have very limited access to the my.ini file. In review, why would you want to configure PHP? You would configure PHP if you need to improve performance or address special needs. The default settings will work very well in most cases. How do you configure PHP? You would edit the php.ini file which is located under the PHP folder, which is under your XAMPP installation folder. You would then need to restart the web server, which will then reload PHP. If you're using the XAMPP control panel, there's a config option next to the Apache server button, which opens up a screen allowing you to edit the PHP INI file. What are the most important PHP parameters to configure? The default date.timezone, output buffering, memory limit, maximum execution time, display errors, error reporting, include path, and also upload tempter, which points to where uploaded files are located. Why would you want to configure MySQL? Normally, the default settings for your system will work quite well. You would only change settings if you notice poor performance. It is recommended that you use the advisor in PHP MyAdmin, which is under the status tab, to perform an analysis first before making changes. The advisor will give you specific recommendations on which settings to change. How do you configure MySQL? First of all, use the PHP MyAdmin advisor to determine settings which should be changed. You would then edit the my.ini file, which is under your XAMPP folder, MySQL bin. What are the most important MySQL parameters to configure? Long query time, log slow queries, cache query size, query cache type, max heap table size, temp table size, key buffer size, open files limit, and thread cache size. But please note, you would only change the parameters if you experience very, very slow performance and you open up the PHP MyAdmin advisor and you notice that there are certain recommendations. This concludes our discussion of configuring PHP and MySQL.